and welcome to the 5th module of the IGMAI Awardees Multimedia online resources devoted to Yves Chevallard and the anthropological theory of the didactic. This module deals with the notion of the scale of levels of didactic codeterminacy. I will show you with an example its link with the notions of praxeology and praxeological organizations that we saw in the previous modules. And I will use this scale to present a brief analysis on some teaching difficulties gathered during a teacher professional development course. We saw in the previous module how Yves Chevallard proposes to define didactics of mathematics as the science that studies the conditions and constraints under which praxeologies start to live, migrate, change, operate, perish, disappear, be reborn, etc., within human groups. The study of the conditions and constraints that exist in educational institutions and beyond correspond to what we call the ecology of praxeological organizations. In the ATD, the term ecology indicates a way of problematizing educational reality. When we analyze teaching and learning processes, we try to identify what makes some activities possible, the conditions, and also what impeds them to exist or to evolve in a given direction, the constraints. In a way, we do not think in terms of what should be done, for instance, how to better teach or to better learn, but in terms of possibilities, what can be done and how, and mainly what cannot be done and why. A key tool for the analysis of the ecology of praxeological organizations is the scale of levels of didactic codeterminacy. In the previous modules, I introduced the notion of praxeological organizations to describe mathematical activities and mathematical knowledge. Even if the notion is general and can be used for any domain of human activity, the way praxeologies are structured can be related to what will become the lower or specific levels of the scale. A ping-pong praxeology that we saw in the previous module can be associated to a question or a type of task. The example we used were the problems of direct proportionality. A local praxeology corresponds to a theme, like the theme of proportionality. A regional praxeology, or an assemblage of local praxeologies around a common theory, can be approximated to a sector, what we usually call a block of content or a strand in a curriculum. If we go upwards, we get a domain made of interrelated sectors and theories. In the case of proportionality, we can think of the sectors of the sector of relationships between quantities, for example, and the domain of change and relationships, just to take some modern labels used today to delimit mathematical curriculum strands. Of course, the structuring can be different. In the classical mathematics, the theme could be the one of simple proportionality, the sector the one of ratios and proportions in the domain of arithmetic. And we can think of many other possible ways of structuring mathematical activities and mathematical knowledge around proportionality. Again, the structuring of praxeologies in question, themes, sectors, and domains is an institutional and historical construction and may vary from one institution to another and evolve in time. Today, for instance, the domain of statistics is evolving very quickly, and it becomes a little oldish to talk about descriptive and inferential statistics when one thinks about visualization, simulation, data cleaning, etc. But the new structuring of the domain is still in its way. How a given discipline is structured and arranged into domains, sectors, themes, etc., is the fruit of a complex process of didactic transposition. And I refer you to Module 1 of this course. As such, they contain a high level of arbitrariness. And of course, the organization can be done in many different ways. Looking back at the whole organization of knowledge is a good exercise to break with the illusion of transparency that lets us think that the current scholarly organization of knowledge is the good and the only possible one. Let us go back to the study of the ecology of praxeological organizations. Considering the specific levels related to the structure of a given discipline is not enough to apprehend the different conditions that can explain the life, creation, and evolution of praxeologies. In the scale of didactic codeterminacy, we consider other levels called the generic levels that also affect and are affected by the ecology of praxeological organizations. Here are the higher levels of the scale. Humanity includes elements shared by all civilizations. In the level of civilizations, we have the elements shared by different societies. Then, in the level of societies, we can include traditions of knowledge dissemination, school regulations, curricular guidelines, etc. The level of the schools corresponds to all the infrastructures provided by educational institutions of any kind. And finally, the level of pedagogies can be related to the way we manage teaching and learning processes independently of the content that is taught and learned. When we consider the lower levels of the scale, we can identify different constraints coming from the specific organization of praxeologies in themes, sectors, and domains. Let me give you just a short example. Today, integers, positive and negative numbers, are taught in the sector of numbers of measure, or something similar, in what corresponds to the old arithmetic. That means that negative numbers are introduced as tools to measure special kind of quantities, the ones that have a direction, like temperature. This produces many constraints, especially to define the product of these measures, but not only. The ecology of integers is very different if one considers them as belonging to the sector or domain of elementary algebra, which corresponds to the historical origin and gives them a solider, even if more intra-mathematical, raison d'etre. To illustrate the higher levels of the scale, I will take an example from a research carried out by our research team in a series of courses given to university lecturers and PhD students. As a starting point of the course, we asked the participants to write down 2 or 3 problems, difficulties, or doubts that they find or think they can find during their teaching practice. This strategy was inspired by the doctoral work of the French researcher Gisèle Sirat, who collected during 3 academic years about 7,000 questions from pre-service secondary school teachers who were combining a course in didactics with their internship at school. What problems do teachers raise? In our case, what problems do lecturers raise? Here is an example of some that correspond to the levels of society and civilization, like the notion of competence or the values related to effort, reward, knowledge consumption. Other questions were related to the school, or here, university, the school infrastructures and devices for teaching and learning. For instance, the number of students per class, time schedule decisions, university facilities, the use of ICT, etc. Some questions refer to the way the teaching of different disciplines is conceived at the university, or the tradition for teachers to work in teams. Oh, I know, the tradition is more about working individually, but I hope things will change soon. I do hope. Okay, we can locate these questions at the level of the school and maybe also the society. In fact, even if we distinguish between the different levels of the scale, in practice, they often appear as mixed. This is why the arrows in the scale, they go up and down, because there is an interrelationship between the levels. Questions at the level of the pedagogy are numerous. Some refer to the students and the way to manage some general aspects of teaching and learning processes, like diversity, behavior, motivation, participation in big lectures, classes, etc. Other questions at the level of the pedagogy deal with issues about teachers, improving the body expression, assessing competencies, giving lectures, etc. And finally, of course, some questions and difficulties refer to the content. Connecting different subjects, selecting the learning goals, relate content to the real world, the balance between specialization and generalization. However, these questions remain rather general, at the level of the discipline, without entering into the detail of the domains and sector, not to talk about themes or topics. Why is it so? Why do teachers have so many difficulties in raising questions about the specific content they have to teach and learn? Why do teachers do not spontaneously raise specific knowledge-related questions? We can advance some hypotheses for that. A first one is because of the interpretation of our assignment and the course goals in this lecture educational course. Not all the teachers of the course were teaching the same subjects or the same degrees, therefore they could think that the questions expected by the educators were generic ones. This is the first hypothesis. We can also think of a problem of legitimacy. The participants of the course were young experts in the subjects they were teaching or about to teach. Therefore, it might not seem appropriate to them raising questions about a content they are supposed to master. A third reason can be related to a phenomenon that Yves Chevallard has called the thematic confinement of teachers. What does it mean? The fact that in current curriculum contracts, teachers are not required to modify the subject structure in domains and sectors. These are given to them, and they are asked to organize the themes and the questions that structure teaching and learning processes. Finally, there is also an important phenomenon that is not always easy to perceive. We can call it the divide between pedagogy and didactics. What do we mean by this? The fact that teaching problems are many times conceived as problems independent of the content that is taught or to be taught. Usually, teaching problems are related to the way a content is taught, not to the content itself. If you let me use a mathematical metaphor, I would say that in a teaching problem, the content is usually a given data, a constant, not a variable. What is variable is the way to teach this content. A consequence of this division is a lack of terminology to go below the level of the pedagogies and start questioning the level of the disciplines related to their teaching and learning. This division is not an isolated phenomenon. Let me show you two small pieces of evidence taken from a teacher course in higher education in one university and from a list of frequently asked questions on the website of another university. As you can see, the main focus is almost always at the level of the pedagogy, with very few incursions to the lower or upper levels. As in the previous modules, I will finish with some questions that maybe you are having in mind at this precise moment. A common one is the level of the pedagogy. Is this what we currently call in many languages and societies? Is it the same pedagogy, or is the term used in a different way? Another question is about the methodology one can use to analyze the constraints and the conditions coming from the higher levels of the scale. Would this mean that a didactician or a researcher in mathematics education must become an expert in school organizations, in societies, must become a sociologist, an anthropologist? I do invite you to try to use the scale to analyze the didactic situations you find around you, to see if you can identify positive conditions enabling the dissemination of praxeologies. The existence of school is an example at the level of the societies. And also to identify some negative constraints limiting this dissemination. Unfortunately, for some kind of praxeologies, schools can also be a constraint to their development. I will talk about that in the next modules. Thank you very much for your attention, and see you soon there.